The crowded airport terminal buzzed with voices, the air thick with the smell of fresh coffee and jet fuel. Amid the chaos, Imani hurried to the boarding gate, her heart pounding. She had just made it through security, late as usual, but determined to catch her flight. As she rushed past the rows of travelers, she wasn't paying attention and collided with someone, her arms wrapping around their waist, in a reflexive hug. Malik was tall, muscular, with a deep voice that immediately made her heart race. "Excuse me, I didn't mean to," she stammered, pulling back. He chuckled, his smile warm, but his dark eyes held something unreadable. Imani froze for a moment, caught off guard by his piercing gaze, and her mind raced. Had she just made a fool of herself in front of a complete stranger? But the moment lingered, and something stirred within her, an unexpected spark. After the brief encounter at the airport, Imani couldn't shake off the strange sensation that lingered in her chest. She tried to convince herself that it was just a fleeting moment, nothing more than an accident. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it had left an impression. Later, as she sat in the waiting area, her eyes kept darting back toward him, as if her body was pulled by some invisible force. He hadn't said much after their awkward introduction, but the brief smile he'd shared stayed in her mind. She wondered who he was, what his life was like. Was he just another wealthy businessman, oblivious to the lives of people like her? Yet something about him made her feel like this encounter wasn't as random as it seemed. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from her best friend, asking if she had made her flight. With a sigh, Imani looked around the terminal again, but Malik was gone, and for a moment she felt a strange sense of loss. Hours passed, and the flight was nearly ready for boarding. Imani couldn't focus on anything else but the brief interaction she'd had earlier. She had never been one to overanalyze, but the curiosity gnawed at her. Who was he? Why did she feel this odd connection, like she'd been swept into a current she couldn't control? Just as she stood up to prepare for her flight, she felt a presence behind her. She turned quickly, and there he was, Malik from earlier, now standing by the gate. Their eyes locked. A silence passed between them, one filled with unspoken words and the weight of their previous encounter. He took a small step forward, his voice low but direct. "I think we should talk," he said, his tone serious yet inviting. For a second, Imani hesitated, but something in his gaze made her take a deep breath and nod. As they exchanged brief pleasantries, Imani couldn't help but notice how effortlessly confident he was, how comfortable he seemed despite the chaos surrounding them. She had always kept to herself, focused on her goals, not one for idle small talk. But with him, it felt different. He wasn't just another businessman. There was an intensity about him that intrigued her. They talked for a few more minutes, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. The more he spoke, the more Imani realized how much she longed for something more, something beyond the mundane routine of her daily life. He asked her what brought her to the airport today, and Imani found herself telling him about her work, her struggles, her dreams. It felt oddly easy, like she could trust him with her truth. He listened intently, his dark eyes never leaving hers, and when he spoke again, it was with the kind of sincerity she rarely encountered. "You're not like the others, Imani," he said, his voice low. "I can see it in your eyes." The moments passed too quickly. As Imani felt the time slipping away, she noticed the boarding call for her flight echoing through the terminal. She looked up at Malik one last time, her heart caught in her throat. "I have to go," she said softly, the words feeling like a quiet regret. He nodded, a slight smile on his lips, though his eyes seemed to convey a different story, one of silent understanding. Before she could walk away, he spoke again. "I hope we meet again, Imani," he said, his voice tinged with sincerity. She nodded, too stunned to say anything else, and turned to leave. But just as she took a few steps, she felt a strange sensation, as if she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder to find him still standing there, his eyes following her. A shiver ran down her spine, and for a moment she wondered if she had just met someone who would change her life forever. The days after their brief encounter had passed like a whirlwind for Imani. Every time she went about her day, she couldn't help but think back to Malik she'd met at the airport. His words, his smile, the intensity in his eyes, they lingered in her mind. Yet, she told herself to focus on her work and move on. After all, nothing had come of their meeting. But fate seemed to have other plans. When she bumped into him once again at a local coffee shop, her heart skipped a beat. This time, he smiled at her like he'd been waiting for her. "Fancy seeing you here," he said with an amused tone. Imani tried to play it cool, but inside, her pulse quickened. The unexpected familiarity between them was too real, too undeniable. There was a magnetic pull she couldn't explain. "Didn't expect to see you here," Imani replied, trying to steady her nerves. He took a step closer, and for a moment, she almost forgot how to breathe. They both sat at a corner table, coffee cups in hand, the silence between them comfortable, yet thick with unspoken thoughts. Imani tried to keep her emotions in check, but the more she listened to his deep voice, the more she found herself drawn to him. He shared stories of his travels, his business ventures, his success, and she listened, captivated by his words, his easy confidence. But a part of her resisted. She didn't belong in his world. She wasn't sure she could ever belong. "You don't talk much about yourself," he said, breaking her thoughts. Imani looked at him, feeling a pang of vulnerability she wasn't used to. She didn't want to open up, didn't want to let anyone in, especially someone like him. "There's not much to tell," she replied softly, looking away. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but she wasn't ready to expose her deepest fears, not yet. The next day, Imani found herself thinking about him again, something that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Why was she so intrigued by him? She had been alone for so long, focused on building a life for herself. But now, with every thought of him, her heart raced a little faster. Later that afternoon, she received a message from her best friend, who had noticed how distant Imani had been lately. "You've got that look again," the message read. "Is it him?" Imani smiled softly at her phone, but didn't respond. Instead, she sat back, gazing out the window, wondering if maybe her friend was right. It wasn't just Malika's charm that drew her in. It was something deeper, something she wasn't ready to face. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was him. "Would you like to join me for dinner tonight?" he asked. She stared at the message for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Should she? Could she? Knit. Later that evening, as she sat across from him at a sleek upscale restaurant, Imani couldn't help but feel out of place. The decor was modern, with dark wood and polished glass. The soft clink of fine china and the low murmur of conversations filled the air. She had never been to a place like this, and the fine dining seemed both intimidating and fascinating. Malik, on the other hand, seemed completely at home. He leaned back in his chair, a confident smile on his lips as he gazed at her, watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his tone almost teasing. Imani shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. She had never been good at these moments, the moments when emotions felt too big to handle. "I'm just trying to take it all in," she said softly. He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her response. "Don't worry, I won't bite." His eyes softened, and Imani found herself smiling despite the nerves tightening in her chest. As the night went on, the conversation flowed easier, the initial awkwardness melting away. Imani found herself laughing, genuinely enjoying his company in a way she hadn't expected. Malik was charming, yes, but there was more to him than that. His intelligence, his wit, his way of making her feel heard, it was all too much for her to ignore. As the meal ended, he asked if she wanted to take a walk in the nearby park. She hesitated for only a moment before agreeing, the excitement and nerves bubbling inside her. Walking side by side under the stars felt surreal, like something out of a dream. Imani couldn't help but smile as they strolled, the quiet night amplifying their shared connection. She had no idea where this was going, but something told her she wasn't ready to walk away just yet. The tension between Imani and Malik had been building for days. Their connection felt undeniable, but Imani couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden. Malik, whose charm had swept her off her feet, remained elusive about certain details of his life. One evening, she found herself standing in front of his lavish apartment, her mind swirling with questions. Why hadn't he told her more about himself? As if sensing her internal struggle, he stepped out to greet her with his usual warm smile. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, his voice low, inviting. Imani's heart skipped a beat, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut. "What aren't you telling me?" she blurted out, surprising herself with the force of her words. Malik froze for a moment, his expression hardening slightly before softening again. "There's a lot I haven't told you, Imani," he admitted. "But I'm not ready to share everything just yet." Her breath caught in her throat. Could she trust him? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? The next few days were filled with unanswered questions and simmering tension. Imani couldn't get Malik's words out of her mind. He had admitted that there was more to his life, but he had stopped short of telling her what it was. She couldn't help but feel like she was walking on thin ice, unsure of whether she was truly ready to uncover the truth. As much as she cared for him, there was a part of her that feared what might be hidden. One evening, Imani decided to confront him again. They met at a quiet park, and as soon as she saw him, her heart began to race. "I can't do this anymore," Imani said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know what you're hiding." Malik's eyes darkened, and for a split second, she saw something flicker in his expression, something raw, something painful. He stepped closer to her, his voice gentle yet firm. "What I haven't told you could change everything," he said. "But I promise you, I care about you, more than you know." Imani took a deep breath, unsure of where this conversation would lead. Days passed, but the tension didn't subside. Imani kept replaying the conversation in her head, wondering what could possibly be hidden from her. It wasn't just the secrecy that bothered her, but the way it made her feel, like she wasn't enough. But every time she saw Malik, his warmth and presence melted her doubts. One evening, after another attempt to draw answers from him, Imani felt a wave of frustration. They were sitting together in a cozy restaurant, a casual place this time, but Imani couldn't shake the feeling that they were moving in circles. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said, her voice firm. He took a deep breath, looking at her as if weighing his next words. "I'm not hiding anything from you," he said slowly, but Imani wasn't convinced. "Then why do I feel like I'm always on the outside of your life?" she asked, her voice cracking. Malik's face softened, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as if contemplating whether he could reveal the truth. "There are things I've done, Imani," he began, his voice quiet. "Things I regret." That night, Imani couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Malik had said, about the regret in his voice. But what did it mean? What kind of man was he? What had he done? She felt like she was being pulled in two different directions. One part of her wanted to run, to protect herself from whatever dark secret he was hiding, and the other part, the part that still felt drawn to him, couldn't walk away. The next morning, Imani received a call from her best friend, who was always a voice of reason. "You've been distant lately. What's going on with you?" her friend asked. Imani sighed, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I don't know. I care about him, but something feels off," she confessed. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." Her friend was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You have to decide, Imani," she said gently. "You can't keep living in limbo." Imani took a deep breath, her heart heavy with indecision. She knew her friend was right. It was time to face the truth, whatever that truth was. The days after her conversation with her friend felt like a blur. Imani couldn't ignore the mounting pressure to confront Malik and demand the answers she needed. She needed clarity, but was she ready to face whatever truth he had been hiding? One evening, she found herself standing in front of his door once again, her heart racing. She didn't want to be afraid anymore. This time, when he opened the door, there was no smile, no warmth, just a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. "We need to talk," Imani said, her voice steady, though her pulse hammered in her chest. Malik nodded and stepped aside, letting her in. "I'll tell you everything, Imani," he said, his voice calm but laden with something heavy. As she stepped inside, she knew this conversation would change everything. After the conversation, Imani couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing between her and Malik, but she wasn't sure if it was for the better. There was a heaviness in the air whenever they were together, a silence that spoke volumes. Imani couldn't tell if the weight of his past was more than she could bear, or if it was something they could work through. Despite the unspoken tension, she found herself wanting to believe in the good, in him. Malik had promised to open up, but as time passed his words became fewer, and the moments of intimacy seemed to fade. One evening, as they sat on the couch in his apartment, Imani tried to bridge the gap. "You've been distant," she said, her voice softer than usual, yet firm with her feelings. "I'm trying to understand, but you're shutting me out." Malik's eyes darkened as he turned to her, his jaw tightening. "I didn't want to drag you into my mess," he admitted, his voice rough. "But you're here now, and I can't seem to push you away." After that conversation, Imani felt a knot form in her stomach every time she saw Malik Ajwal. The silence between them grew, and it seemed like he was closing himself off more than ever. Despite his words, something didn't add up. Her trust in him was starting to crumble, and she couldn't ignore the fact that there were too many unanswered questions. One day, as they were walking through a quiet street, she couldn't keep it in any longer. "I need to know if you're telling me the truth," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Because I can't keep giving pieces of myself to someone who won't do the same." Malik stopped in his tracks, looking at her with an unreadable expression. "You don't know what it's like to have your whole life fall apart," he said, his voice low. Imani's heart clenched. "I'm not asking you to tell me everything, but I need something real," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Weeks passed, and the space between Imani and Malik seemed to widen despite their attempts to bridge the gap. "Oh." Imani continued to pour herself into her work, trying to push the feelings of betrayal to the back of her mind. But with each passing day, it became harder to ignore the coldness between them. Then one night, Malik showed up at her apartment, unannounced, standing in the doorway with a look of desperation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice strained. Imani's heart pounded as she opened the door, unsure of what to expect. "I'm sorry," he continued, his eyes filled with regret. "I've been hiding too much, and it's not fair to you. I've been a coward." Imani felt a wave of relief mixed with anger wash over her. "You don't get to do that," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't get to shut me out and then show up like this." Malik stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I know I've hurt you, but I need you to understand. I didn't want to pull you into my world because I thought it would destroy us." That night, Imani found herself pacing around her apartment, torn between wanting to believe Malik's words and the fear that trusting him would only lead to more pain. She didn't know what to do, didn't know if she could let him back in after everything. The next day she met with her best friend at a cafe, hoping for some clarity. "What if I'm just fooling myself?" Imani asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he's never going to change?" Her best friend took a sip of her coffee before responding. "You have to make the decision for yourself. Don't stay because you're afraid to be alone. Stay because you believe in him, and in what the two of you could be." Imani let the words sink in, the weight of the decision hanging over her. As she sat there contemplating, she realized that she had already made up her mind. It wasn't about waiting for him to change, it was about finding the courage to trust again. After days of reflection, Imani knew what she had to do. That evening, she made her way to Malik's apartment once again, her heart steady with resolve. When he opened the door, she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. She didn't give him a chance to speak. "I've decided," Imani said firmly. "I'm willing to try, but you have to meet me halfway. No more secrets, no more running." Malik's face softened, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Imani saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I won't run," he promised, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of their pasts hanging in the air, but in that silence, there was a glimmer of something new, a chance for healing, for growth. And as Imani stepped inside, she knew that they both had a long road ahead, but for the first time, she was willing to walk it with him. Days passed after Imani's decision, and she tried to settle into a new routine, attempting to trust Malik again. The weight of her choice felt both relieving and settling. She couldn't ignore the anxiety that buzzed beneath the surface, the fear that things might fall apart again. Then one evening, everything changed. Malik called her unexpectedly, his voice urgent. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone different from usual, serious, almost pleading. Imani's stomach twisted with uncertainty. She arrived at his apartment, trying to steady her breathing. When the door opened, she saw the raw emotion on his face, something she hadn't expected. "There's something I've been keeping from you," he said, his voice thick with regret. Imani's heart pounded in her chest. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not who you think I am," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor. Imani's mind raced. Was this the moment where everything unraveled? The moment hung in the air between them. Malik stepped back into the apartment, and Imani followed him, her mind spinning with possibilities. What could he possibly be hiding? She didn't know if she was ready for the truth, but she knew she couldn't back away now. Malik turned to her, his voice quieter, heavier. "I've been involved in something dangerous," he confessed, his eyes avoiding hers. "I've made choices in the past that have come back to haunt me." Imani's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Malik looked up at her, his expression filled with shame. "I'm not just a businessman. I've been involved in illegal activities," he said, his voice cracking. Imani stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. "I've hurt people, Imani," he continued, "and I'm trying to get out, but it's not easy." She struggled to process what he had just said, her heart racing as the truth washed over her. Could she really forgive him for this? The silence between them felt deafening. Imani tried to absorb his words, but the weight of what he had just told her was almost too much to bear. Her hands trembled as she took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She looked at Malik, his face etched with guilt and vulnerability. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotions raging inside her. Malik looked up, meeting her gaze. "I didn't want you to get involved," he admitted. "I thought I could handle it on my own." Imani shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I would have stood by you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you trust me enough?" He reached out toward her, but she stepped back, her emotions bubbling to the surface. "You don't get to ask for my trust now," she said, her voice shaking with hurt. "Not after everything." Malik stood there silent as Imani turned away from him, unable to hold back the tears anymore. The days following the confrontation were some of the hardest Imani had faced. Malik had given her space, respecting her need for time to process everything. But his absence only made her feel more conflicted. She missed him, even though his secrets had shattered the trust they had built. One evening, she found herself standing outside his apartment again, unsure of what to do. As she raised her hand to knock on the door, she hesitated. Was she ready to face him? Was she ready to forgive him? The door opened before she could decide, and Malik stood in front of her, his expression softer than before. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Imani swallowed, the lump in her throat making it hard to speak. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to understand why you kept all of this from me." Malik stepped back, inviting her in. "I'll tell you everything, Imani," he said, his voice steady. "But you have to be willing to listen." Inside the apartment, Imani sat on the couch, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Malik sat across from her, his eyes filled with sincerity as he began to explain everything. Imani listened in silence, her heart heavy with the weight of his confession. He told her about the dangerous world he had been a part of, the choices he had made, and the consequences he now faced. "I'm done with all of it," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I want to be with you, Imani." Imani's heart ached as she processed his words. She didn't know if she could trust him completely, but she knew that she couldn't keep living in the shadow of his secrets. I don't know if I can trust you again, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm willing to try. I need to believe in us. Malik's face softened and he nodded. I'll do whatever it takes, he promised. I won't run from you anymore. Imani looked at him, her emotions a whirlwind, but for the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. It had been weeks since their last conversation, and though Imani had tried to move forward, the shadows of the past still loomed over her. Malik, despite his promises, had distanced himself once again, retreating into his own world. As the days passed, Imani struggled to hold on to hope. Late one night she received a text from him, simply saying, "Can we meet?" Her heart raced, as she wondered if he was finally ready to face everything between them. She agreed, though doubts swirled in her mind. When they met in the park the next day, the atmosphere between them was charged with unspoken emotions. "I need to know where we stand," Imani said, her voice trembling. "Are we just trying to fix something broken? Or are we building something new?" Malik sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the words. "Imani, I've been trying to fix things, but I've realized I can't do it alone," he said, his voice low and filled with guilt. Imani looked at him, her heart torn between the longing to believe in him and the fear of further betrayal. "You can't keep running from the truth," she replied, her voice firm but soft. "If we're going to move forward, we have to face everything, together." He nodded, stepping closer, the distance between them narrowing. "I've been afraid of losing you," he confessed, his eyes softening. "But I've lost myself too, Imani. I don't want to be that person anymore." She met his gaze, the vulnerability in his eyes pulling at her heartstrings. For the first time in weeks, she saw a glimmer of Malik she had fallen for. "Then show me," she whispered. "Prove it." The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Imani and Malik began to talk about their pasts, the things they'd kept hidden, the pain they'd both endured. It wasn't easy, but they were beginning to build a new foundation. One evening, as they sat together in a cafe, the conversation took a different turn. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Malik began, his voice hesitant. "Imani, I want to start over, but I need you to know that it's going to take time. I need to prove to you that I can be Malik you deserve." Imani listened carefully, her heart beating faster with each word. She didn't want to hear excuses, but she understood the depth of his struggle. "We both have scars," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we can't heal together." Malik looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear, the weight of his past still heavy between them. Yet in that moment, there was something different, a spark of possibility. As time passed, the distance between Imani and Malik began to shrink. Though they still had many hurdles to overcome, they were learning to trust each other again. One evening as they walked through the city, Imani found herself letting go of the fear that had consumed her for so long. "You've come a long way," she said quietly, her hand brushing against his. Malik glanced at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm not perfect," he replied, his voice low. "But I'm trying." Imani looked up at him, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "I see that," she said with a soft smile. "And I'm willing to fight for this, for us." As they continued to walk, the city lights shimmering around them, Imani felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it, hand in hand with him. It was a quiet evening when Imani received a call that would change everything. Malik was on the other end, his voice unusually tense. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his words rushed. Imani felt her heart drop, the sudden shift in his tone sending a wave of panic through her. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "I'm in trouble," he confessed. "I didn't want to pull you into this, but now, I don't know what to do." Imani's mind raced, her emotions a whirlwind. She had fought so hard to rebuild their trust, and now, just as she was starting to believe in their future, the past threatened to tear it all down. She knew she had to decide whether to run or to face this new challenge by his side. After the phone call, Imani spent hours pacing her apartment, unable to calm the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. Malik's words echoed in her head, and the weight of his confession felt like a burden she couldn't bear. How could she trust him again, when the past continued to chase them? But as the hours passed, something shifted inside her. She realized that trust wasn't something she could just give away. It was something she would have to build, piece by piece. When Malik showed up at her apartment later that evening, his face was drawn with worry. "I never wanted to drag you into my mess," he said, his voice thick with regret. Imani met his gaze, her expression steady. "You didn't. I'm here because I want to be. But we need to move forward. Together." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their pasts hanging between them, but in that silence, Imani knew that they were finally ready to face the future. The days after their conversation were a whirlwind. Imani and Malik began to rebuild, step by step, each conversation and moment shared bringing them closer. Despite the uncertainty, she began to feel something she hadn't in a long time: hope. One afternoon they sat in the park, their usual spot, the place where they had first opened up to one another. "I never thought we'd get here," Imani said, her voice soft but full of meaning. Malik looked at her, his eyes warm. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I'm here now, Imani. I'm ready to fight for us." Imani smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and affection. "I'm ready too," she whispered. As they sat there, the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them, ready to face whatever came next. Weeks passed, and things began to settle into a new rhythm. Imani felt like she was finally allowing herself to trust him again, though the fear of the past still lingered in the back of her mind. One evening, as they sat together in her apartment, Malik took her hand gently in his. "I want to show you that I can be Malik you deserve," he said, his voice filled with determination. Imani turned to him, her heart fluttering at the sincerity in his eyes. "I believe you," she whispered, squeezing his hand. As they sat there, their shared silence spoke volumes. It was a silence full of understanding, healing, and the promise of a future built on trust. The turning point came when Imani found herself standing at a crossroads. A choice had to be made, to either fully embrace the future with Malik or walk away from the past that still haunted her. It wasn't an easy decision, and her heart ached with the uncertainty. One evening, after another difficult conversation, Imani stood in front of Malik, her emotions raw. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly, her voice filled with vulnerability. "But I'm willing to face it with you if you are." Malik's eyes softened, and he stepped closer to her, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going anywhere, Imani. Not this time. I'll be here, no matter what." Imani's heart soared with relief as she realized that, no matter how hard the road ahead would be, they would face it together. The final decision had been made. Imani and Malik, after everything they had been through, stood together in the quiet of the night. The future was still uncertain, but they had taken the first step towards healing. As they stood on the balcony of Malika's apartment, the city sprawled beneath them, and Imani felt the weight of the world slowly lifting from her shoulders. "We've come a long way," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet hope. Malik looked at her, his expression one of both relief and determination. "We still have a long way to go," he said, but there was a warmth in his voice, a promise. Together, they had learned that love was not just about passion, but about forgiveness, understanding, and the willingness to fight for each other. The night stretched out before them, full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Imani felt ready for whatever came next.